The dust-covered stranger rode into Caldwell, Kansas on a Tuesday in the autumn of 1878, looking like something the prairie wind had dragged in and forgotten to take back out. Evelyn Wainwright stood on the front porch of her modest homestead at the edge of town, watching him come down the main road, with the kind of wariness a woman learns quickly when she is raising a child alone, and the world has already taken the one person who made her feel safe. She had one hand shielding her eyes from the late afternoon sun, the other resting on the doorframe as though she might need to step back inside at a moment's notice. Her dark hair was pinned up in the practical way she always wore it these days, nothing like the careful curls she used to set on Saturday evenings when Thomas was still alive, and there was something to dress for. Now there was only survival, and survival did not require curls. The man on horseback was tall, even sitting down. She could tell that much from this distance. His hat was battered at the brim and pulled low over his face, and his clothes, though clean enough, were worn at the elbows and faded from too many days under the open sky. His horse, a bay gelding of decent stock, moved with the tired but steady rhythm of an animal that had covered serious ground recently. There was a bedroll strapped behind the saddle, a single saddlebag, and a rifle in the scabbard. Nothing else that she could see. He did not stop at the saloon, which was the first thing most men did when they came through Caldwell. He did not stop at the general store either. He rode slowly, looking from side to side with calm, measured eyes, and then his horse simply stopped in front of the livery stable, and he dismounted with the easy grace of a man who had done it 10,000 times. Evelyn told herself she was not watching him. She had too much to do to watch strangers ride into town. She had bread to bake and 2 hens to feed, and a fence post on the north side of the property that had been leaning at an increasingly alarming angle for the past 3 weeks. She had her son, Caleb, who was 7 years old and full of questions and bruised knees, and the kind of energy that made her grateful and exhausted in equal measure. She went inside. Caleb was sitting at the kitchen table, pushing a carved wooden horse back and forth across the worn surface, making quiet sounds with his mouth that were meant to be hoofbeats. He had Thomas's eyes, that pale clear gray that looked silver in certain light, and Thomas's way of concentrating on something small as though it were the most important thing in the world. "Supper will be a while yet," Evelyn said, moving to the bread dough she had set aside to rise. "Mama," Caleb said, "there is a man outside. I saw him. He looks hungry." Evelyn pressed the heel of her hand into the dough. "Most men in this territory look hungry, sweetheart. He looks extra hungry." She did not answer that. She worked the dough and thought about the bill at the general store, and the fact that the flour she was using right now was nearly the last of what she had bought 3 weeks ago, and she did not have money to buy more until she sold the 2 quilts she had been finishing by lamplight for the past month. Mrs. Calloway at the dry goods store had promised her a fair price, but fair prices in Caldwell were not always what the word suggested, and Evelyn was not in a position to negotiate. Thomas had died 14 months ago. A fever, the doctor in Wichita had said, though he had looked uncomfortable saying it, as if he suspected something else and did not want to commit to it. Thomas Wainwright had been 31 years old, strong and healthy all his life, and then in the space of 3 weeks he had been gone, and Evelyn had been left with Caleb and 40 acres of wheat that she did not entirely know how to farm, and debts that Thomas had kept from her because he believed a woman should not worry about money. She had learned to worry about money. She had learned to worry about a great many things. She did not think again about the man at the livery until the following morning, when she walked Caleb to the small schoolhouse at the east end of Caldwell's Main Street, and she saw the stranger sitting on the steps of the general store, nursing a cup of coffee and looking out at the street with those same calm, measuring eyes that she had noticed yesterday from her porch. Up close, he was different than she had expected. His face was weathered, yes, but not in the way of a man who had lived hard and careless. There were fine lines at the corners of his eyes and deeper ones carved from nose to mouth, but his jaw was clean-shaved this morning, and his dark brown hair, though shaggy at the collar, had been combed. He was perhaps 34, 35. It was difficult to say. His eyes, when they lifted to look at her as she passed, were a very dark blue, nearly gray in the early morning light, and they were sharp in a way that did not belong to someone who merely drifted. He nodded politely. Evelyn nodded back, because that was what you did in Caldwell, and then she moved Caleb along the street with a firm hand on his shoulder. "That is the man," Caleb said knowingly, the way 7-year-olds say things they believe to be significant observations. "I know who he is," Evelyn said, which was not entirely accurate. She dropped Caleb at school, exchanged a few words with Mrs. Harmon, the schoolteacher, about the geography lesson and whether Caleb was keeping up, and then walked back along the main street toward the general store because she needed to see Mrs. Calloway about the quilts. The stranger was still on the steps. He had finished his coffee and now had his hands loosely clasped between his knees, watching the street with the patience of a man who had nowhere urgently to be. There was something almost meditative about his stillness that struck her as unusual. Most drifters who came through Caldwell were fidgety, restless, eyeing the saloon, or looking for work or trouble, usually in that order. This man looked as though he were simply thinking, deeply and without hurry. Mrs. Calloway was a sharp-faced woman in her 50s who had run the dry goods store with iron efficiency since her husband Ned had passed 6 years ago, and who regarded generosity as a kind of weakness. She examined Evelyn's quilts with the particular frown of someone who intends to find fault whether or not fault exists. $8 for the pair, Mrs. Calloway said. "You said 12 when I started them," Evelyn said. "Market's soft, 8 is fair." It was not fair. Evelyn knew it was not fair. The quilts were beautifully made, 6 months of careful work in the evenings after Caleb was asleep, complex patterns in blues and creams that any woman in Caldwell would have been proud to put on her bed. But Mrs. Calloway knew that Evelyn needed the money, and need was a kind of leverage. 10, Evelyn said. Mrs. Calloway looked at her for a long moment and then said, 9. "Done," Evelyn said, because 9 was better than 8 and she was too tired to fight for the extra dollar. She walked out of the general store with $9 in her pocket and a feeling in her chest that was not quite despair but was somewhere in its neighborhood. She passed the steps where the stranger had been sitting, but he was no longer there. She looked up and down the street and did not see him, and she told herself she had not been looking for him specifically and went home to repair the fence post. The fence post repair took most of the afternoon, involved 2 bent nails, a blister on her right palm, and a vocabulary of frustration that she was grateful Caleb was not present to hear. By the time she had it standing acceptably upright and had packed the base with enough tamped earth to hold it through the winter, the sun was already dropping behind the ridge to the west, and the air had taken on the cold, clean bite of an October evening. She called it good enough and went inside to start supper. Caleb came home from school with mud on both knees, a drawing of a horse he had done during lessons, and a story about a boy named Robbie Totham who had said something unkind about a girl in class and had been sent to stand in the corner by Mrs. Harmon. Evelyn listened to all of this while she made a simple corn porridge, which was not what she would have chosen to feed her son but was what they had, and she stretched it with the last of the dried beans and tried to make it seem like enough. It was not quite enough. She knew this, and Caleb probably knew this too, but he was a good boy and he ate what was put in front of him without complaint, and she loved him with a ferocity that sometimes made it hard to breathe. After supper, while Caleb was getting ready for bed, there was a knock at the door. Evelyn went to it carefully, the way women who live alone go to unexpected evening knocks, with one hand on the doorframe and her weight balanced in a way that would let her move quickly if she needed to. She opened the door 6 inches. The stranger stood on her front step, hat in hand. In the lamplight from the doorway, she could see him more clearly than she had before. He was indeed tall, several inches over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that his worn coat could not quite conceal. His dark blue eyes found her face immediately and stayed there, direct and calm. "I apologize for the hour, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and deliberate, with a trace of something in it that was not quite a southern accent and not quite western, as though he had spent time in many places and absorbed a little of each. "I'm not looking for trouble or charity. I noticed your fence post this afternoon. I was watching from the street. I thought you might want to know that the way you've set it, it won't hold past the first hard freeze. The ground needs to be packed differently around the base." Evelyn stared at him. "You came to my door at supper time to tell me about my fence post." "I did," he said. "I would have come this afternoon to help, but I wasn't sure it would be welcome." "It would not have been," she said honestly. Something moved in his eyes that might have been amusement, though he kept his expression properly serious. "I figured as much, but the fence is still going to fail. I thought you should know, so you could fix it before the freeze or ask someone who you would welcome to help." She studied him for a moment. He did not look away, but he was not challenging about it. He simply looked at her the way she imagined a man looks at something he is trying to understand. "Who are you?" she asked. "Name's Phineas Sheridan," he said. "I'm just passing through." "Where are you passing through from?" "West," he said. "And you're passing through to?" "East," he said, and this time the trace of something that might be amusement was unmistakable. Evelyn did not know whether to be irritated or amused herself. She settled on a middle ground. "Mr. Sheridan, thank you for the information about the fence post. I will address it." "Yes, ma'am." He put his hat back on. "Good evening." He stepped off the porch and walked away into the darkening street with that same unhurried, self-contained quality she had noticed before, and Evelyn stood in the doorway and watched him go and thought, against her better judgment, that she would very much like to know what a man like that was actually thinking. The next morning was the morning of the biscuit. It happened like this. Evelyn had risen early, as she always did, and baked a small batch of biscuits to go with the eggs she had collected from her 2 hens, intending them to last through breakfast and perhaps a bit beyond. She sent Caleb off to school with 2 biscuits wrapped in a cloth for his lunch, and walked along the main street on her way to see Mr. Greer at the bank about a small matter of an overdue interest payment that she had been putting off facing. The morning was cold and clear, one of those October mornings in Kansas that makes the whole world look like it has been cut sharply from the sky, every edge precise and bright. Her breath made small clouds in the air. The street was quiet this early, only a few people about, a couple of horses tied in front of the saloon from the night before, a dog asleep in a patch of sunlight outside the barber shop. She passed the alley beside the livery stable and heard her son's voice. Her heart did a thing it did whenever she heard something in Caleb's voice that was not right. She stopped, went back 3 steps and looked down the alley. Caleb was there. He had not gone to school. He was standing in the shadow of the alley wall, and across from him, seated on an overturned crate with his back against the livery stable's side wall, was Phineas Sheridan. The man was unwrapping something from a cloth, and Evelyn could see it was the last of his provisions from the previous night, a single biscuit, somewhat flattened, that he had clearly been saving. Caleb was watching this with the wide-eyed focus that 7-year-olds give to things they want very much but have been taught not to ask for. Phineas Sheridan looked at the biscuit in his hand, then at Caleb, then held it out to the boy without a word. Caleb looked at it. Then he looked at the man. "Don't you want it?" "I've eaten," the man said, which Evelyn was quite certain was not true. Caleb took the biscuit. He did not immediately eat it, which surprised her because Caleb was always hungry. Instead, he broke it in half and held one half back out toward the man. "My mama says you should always share," he said with the solemn gravity of a child repeating a moral lesson. Phineas Sheridan looked at the offered half-biscuit for a moment, and something crossed his face that Evelyn could not name from the alley entrance, something that was not quite grief and not quite warmth but was related to both. He took the offered half. They sat there in the alley, the large quiet man and the small serious boy, eating the halves of the biscuit together in the morning cold, and Evelyn stood at the alley entrance with her hand over her heart and felt something shift in her chest that she did not entirely want to feel. She stepped forward. Caleb Wainwright. Both of them looked up. Caleb had the expression of someone who has been caught doing something that is not quite wrong but is not quite right either. Phineas Sheridan simply looked at her, and she could see now that she had been correct about the biscuit because there was the particular kind of steadiness on his face that a hungry man wears when he is pretending not to be. "School," she said to Caleb. "I was going," Caleb said. "You were going in the wrong direction." She looked at Phineas Sheridan. "Good morning, Mr. Sheridan." "Good morning, Mrs. Wainwright," he said. He had learned her name somewhere, from the town, presumably. Caldwell was small enough that names moved around it like water. "I want to thank you," she said, and it cost her something to say it because she did not like accepting things from strangers. "For your kindness to my son. He was good company," Phineas said simply. "He told me about the wooden horse he has at home and about the fence post." Evelyn looked at Caleb, who had the good sense to look slightly sheepish. "Did he?" "He did." The man got to his feet unhurried, and he was indeed very tall standing, and she was aware of this in a way that she had not been at her doorway the evening before, perhaps because in the alley the space was smaller. "He said you fixed it yourself yesterday. He seemed very proud of you for that." Evelyn did not know what to do with that particular piece of information, so she did what she usually did with things she did not know how to handle, which was to move past them briskly. "I appreciated your warning. I did what I could with it. If it fails, I will have someone look at it properly." "I could look at it," he said. "No charge. I have nothing particular to do today." "You're passing through," she reminded him. "I'm in no hurry," he said. She studied him. He returned her study with the same directness she had noticed the first time, the quality of a man who has nothing to hide, or who has learned to appear as though he does not. She could not yet tell which it was. "I will give you breakfast," she said finally, "in exchange for the fence post. That's fair." "That is more than fair," he said. She took Caleb to school first, walking him all the way to the door and giving him a look that he understood perfectly well meant that she would be checking with Mrs. Harmon about his arrival time, and then she walked back toward her homestead with Phineas Sheridan walking alongside her at a respectful distance. They did not say much on the walk. The morning sun was lifting, and the air was warming by degrees, and the prairie to the west of Caldwell was the color of dry honey in the autumn light, vast and still and beautiful in the way that places are beautiful when they are also dangerous. She made him scrambled eggs and 2 biscuits, fresh ones, and coffee, and he ate all of it with a composure that confirmed what she had suspected, that he was genuinely hungry. But he ate it slowly and properly, and he did not eat as though he had been starved, which she found interesting. There was a quality to his hunger that was temporary, she thought, rather than chronic. As though he were a man who normally ate very well and had recently fallen on a brief rough patch. He sat at her kitchen table and she sat across from him, and they had coffee together after the food, and he looked around the kitchen the way someone looks at a place they are trying to understand rather than judge. "You've been here long?" he asked. 3 years, she said. "My husband homesteaded this land in 1875. We came from Ohio." And he passed. The question was direct but not unkind. "Last year, 14 months ago." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Fever." He nodded once slowly. He did not say he was sorry, which she found she preferred. She was exhausted by people saying they were sorry. It was the right thing to say, and it meant nothing, and everyone said it, and she was tired of it. "The boy is a good one," he said instead. "He is the best thing in my life," she said. "He is also sometimes an absolute trial." "That sounds right for 7, Phineas Sheridan said, and there was something in the way he said it that suggested personal knowledge, though whether of his own childhood or something else she could not tell. "Do you have children?" she asked, which was more forward than she intended. "No," he said, a brief pause. "No wife either, before you wonder." She felt heat in her cheeks that she hoped the morning light was too generous to reveal. "I was not wondering." "Of course not," he said, and this time the trace of amusement was completely audible. She stood up and began to clear the table. He stood as well and picked up his own plate and cup, which surprised her, and brought them to the basin by the window without being asked. She did not say anything about this, but she noticed it. He spent the next 2 hours on her fence post. She watched from the kitchen window while she worked on a new quilt piece, and what she saw was a man who understood tools and land with the easy competence of someone who had done physical work, though his hands, she had noticed at the table, did not have the particular roughness of a man who worked with them daily. He knew how to do it, but he did not do it for a living. That was her impression. He packed the base of the post differently than she had, using a flat stone she had not thought to look for, and mixed the packed earth with a small amount of water from her trough to create a harder set. And when he was done, the post stood with a solidity that she could see even from the window. He came back to the door afterward and knocked, even though she had left it open. "It will hold," he said. "Thank you," she said. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Sheridan?" "Yes." "What are you actually doing in Caldwell?" He considered this for a moment with the same unhurried quality he brought to everything. "Resting," he said. "From what?" "A long road," he said. She should have left it there. She told herself to leave it there. Instead, she said, "and before the long road." He looked at her with those dark blue eyes that were so steady they were almost unsettling. "Business," he said. "I was in business for a long time. I came to need a rest from it." "What kind of business?" She pressed, and she heard herself and felt a flash of embarrassment at her own nosiness. But he did not look put out. He looked, if anything, as though the question amused him in some private way. "The kind that keeps you busy," he said. "I'll be on my way now, Mrs. Wainwright. Thank you for the breakfast. Thank you for the fence post." He nodded and put on his hat and walked back toward the main street, and she watched him go and thought that she had never in her life met a man who said so little and communicated so much. He did not leave Caldwell the next day, or the day after that. She saw him at the edge of town, sitting on the fence rail of Clarkson's cattle yard, just watching the animals with that meditative stillness. She saw him at the church on Sunday, sitting in the back pew, hat in his lap, listening to Reverend Hollis's sermon with what appeared to be genuine attention. She saw him buying what looked like a very small amount of food at the general store, just enough for a day or two, as though he had not decided yet how long he was staying. On Wednesday he appeared at the schoolhouse when she was there to collect Caleb at the end of the day, and he had, somehow, acquired a small carved wooden bird, clearly made from a piece of wood he had worked himself, and he held it out to Caleb as the boy came running out the door. Caleb stopped and looked at the bird with the solemn evaluation of a child who knows something of value when he sees it. "Did you make this?" Caleb asked. "I did," Phineas said. Caleb looked at his mother. Evelyn looked at Phineas. "You whittle," she said. "I have been known to," he said. "Mama," Caleb said, "can I have it?" "It is for you," Phineas said to Caleb before Evelyn could answer. "It is a meadowlark, the Kansas state bird, though it has only been the state bird for, let us say, as long as birds have been in Kansas." Caleb laughed at this with the whole-body delight of a boy who found jokes funnier when they were told by someone with a serious face. Evelyn looked at Phineas Sheridan and felt the thing in her chest shift again, larger this time, uncomfortable like a sleeping thing turning over. "Walk with us," Caleb said to Phineas, with the absolute directness that children reserve for asking things adults are afraid to ask. Phineas Sheridan looked at Evelyn, properly checking, not assuming. She looked at her son and then at the man and said, "You are welcome to." They walked home through the cool October afternoon, Caleb running ahead and then circling back with the endless circling energy of a young boy who cannot quite contain himself within the speed of walking adults. He told Phineas about school, about Robbie Totham, about the carved horse at home, about how his father had built the fence that Phineas had fixed, and how it was one of the last things he had done before getting sick. Phineas listened to all of this with the same quality of genuine attention he seemed to bring to everything. He did not talk down to Caleb or over-explain things, or use the bright, patronizing voice that some adults used with children. He simply spoke to him as he would a person, which Evelyn noticed and filed away in the growing collection of things she was noticing about Phineas Sheridan. When they reached the homestead, Phineas did not come in. He stopped at the gate and said he would be getting back to the livery, and Caleb protested this with the openness of a child who wants what he wants, and Evelyn found herself saying, "You could stay for supper, if you have nothing else." He accepted with the kind of simple gratitude that was not effusive or embarrassing. She made a simple stew with the rabbit that old Mr. Gaines from 2 homesteads over had brought by earlier that week in payment for some mending she had done for him, and she made cornbread, and it was a real supper, not the stretched thin meals she had been managing, and there was enough for 3 with a little left over. They sat at the table and Caleb talked and Phineas answered him, and occasionally looked across the table at Evelyn with that steady measuring gaze. And she cooked and served and sat and ate and looked back at him and thought things she had not thought in 14 months. After supper Caleb fell asleep almost immediately, the way children do when they have spent a day full of energy and fresh air, and Evelyn tucked him in and came back to the kitchen to find that Phineas had washed the dishes. She stood in the doorway and looked at him at her basin, sleeves rolled to the elbow, washing dishes like it was something he did every day, and she said, "You keep doing things I do not ask you to do." He turned around, drying his hands on the cloth she kept hanging by the basin. "Bad habit," he said. "It is not a bad habit," she said. "It is a confusing one." He looked at her steadily. The lamp was lit on the table and it made the kitchen warm and golden, and outside the October wind had picked up and was pressing against the windows with a sound like breathing. "I should not keep imposing on your evenings," he said. "You are not imposing," she said, which was the truest thing she had said to him so far. He folded the drying cloth very neatly over the basin edge, and she thought, looking at that folded cloth, that there was something about the gesture that was not the gesture of a rough man or a careless one. It was the gesture of someone who had been taught a certain standard and kept to it automatically, without thinking. "Mr. Sheridan," she said, "I would like to understand something." "Ask it," he said. "Are you truly just passing through, because you have been here a week and you do not seem to be passing anywhere?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I came through Caldwell because I heard it was a quiet place to rest for a few days, and it has been," he paused, "more interesting than I expected." "Interesting," she repeated. "In the best sense," he said. She did not know how to answer that, so she walked to the door and opened it, because it was time for him to go, and because she needed the cool air that came in from outside to clear her head. He picked up his hat from the peg by the door where Caleb had hung it earlier with the proprietary confidence of a child who has decided someone belongs in a space, and he put it on and stepped out into the cold night. "Good night, Mrs. Wainwright," he said. "Good night, Mr. Sheridan," she said. She watched him walk back toward the main street until the dark swallowed him, and then she closed the door and pressed her back against it, and stood there in the warm kitchen and thought very firmly that she was not going to make anything of this. She was a practical woman. She had a son to raise and a homestead to keep, and not enough money and too many problems. She did not have room in her life for whatever this was. She went to bed and lay awake for an hour thinking about the way he had folded the drying cloth. The following Friday, something happened that changed things. Evelyn had gone to the bank to make her overdue interest payment, the visit she had been avoiding, and Mr. Greer, who was a small, tight-mouthed man with a quality of satisfaction about him that she found difficult to be in the same room with, had told her that the bank was considering calling in the full note on her property by year's end if the payments could not be maintained. She had sat across from him in the dark wood-paneled office and kept her face composed and her voice level and agreed that she understood, and then she had walked out of the bank into the bright cold October morning and stood on the boardwalk and breathed carefully until the feeling of falling stopped. The homestead, Thomas's homestead. The land he had broken his back over for 2 years, the house he had built himself, the fence he had set. The place where Caleb had been born. She could not lose it. She simply could not. She was standing there with her fists clenched at her sides when Phineas Sheridan came out of the general store across the street and looked at her and crossed the street without hesitation, because apparently the man could read her face from 50 feet away. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing." she said. Evelyn. It was the first time he had used her first name, and it came out of his mouth with a natural ease that suggested he had been thinking of her by it for some time. He did not seem to notice he had done it, or perhaps he noticed and decided not to take it back. What happened? She looked at him and thought with a clarity that surprised her that she was tired of carrying things alone. She had been carrying things alone for 14 months, and before that, if she was honest, for longer than that, because Thomas had kept things from her in the name of protection, and it had left her ill-equipped for the very situation she now faced. "The bank may call in my note," she said, "before year's end. I cannot keep up with the payments, and they know it." He was quiet for a moment. His face was very still. "How much is owed?" "It is not your concern," she said immediately. "I am asking," he said, "because I would like to know the scope of the problem. Not because I am inserting myself into your affairs." She hesitated. $42 in arrears, and the interest for the quarter, another 18, $60 total, near enough. He absorbed this without visible reaction, which she found faintly irritating. Most people reacted to $60. "When is year's end for their purposes?" he asked. "Mr. Greer said December, but I think he has some discretion in that. He is not a generous man." "No," Phineas agreed, in a tone that suggested he had formed his own assessment of Mr. Greer in the week he had been in Caldwell, which she supposed was not difficult. "I will sell the next pair of quilts by then," she said, pulling herself upright. "Have fabric, I can work quickly, and I have some other work. Mrs. Patterson asked me about altering her daughter's dress for the harvest social. I will manage it." "I have no doubt," he said. "Stop that," she said. "Stop what? Looking at me like that?" He tilted his head very slightly. "Like what?" She did not know how to answer that without saying something that would embarrass her thoroughly, so she said, "Like you know something I do not," which was not exactly what she meant but was close enough. Something moved in his eyes. "I apologize," he said, and he meant it, she could tell, but he was also not quite able to remove the quality she had objected to. That evening he came for supper without being invited, and she let him in without comment, and they ate together, and Caleb talked about horses, and afterward Phineas and Caleb sat on the porch in the cold, and Phineas whittled while Caleb watched with absolute absorption, and Evelyn stood inside at the window and watched them both and felt something that she recognized, after a moment, as peace. The particular kind of peace that comes when something that has been missing returns. She pressed her hand flat against the window glass and told herself to be careful. He had said he was passing through, but he was still here. The Saturday of the harvest social, which Caldwell held every October in the livery stable because it was the largest covered space in town, Evelyn arrived with Caleb in his best shirt, which she had patched at the elbows so carefully the patches were nearly invisible, and her own dark blue dress that she had made 2 years ago and still fit well, and her hair done differently than usual, down and pinned at the sides rather than fully up, which was a small concession she made to the fact that it was a social occasion, and she was a woman who, before all this, had cared about such things. Phineas Sheridan was there. He was standing near the back of the space with a cup of cider, talking to old Hector Gaines, who was one of the few men in Caldwell who seemed to have taken to him, and he was wearing a clean shirt she had not seen before, dark gray, with the collar pressed. His hair had been cut, she noticed. Not dramatically, but enough that it no longer curled quite so shabbily at his collar. When he saw her come in, something happened in his face that was brief and involuntary and then carefully neutral again, but she had seen it, and the knowledge of it sat in her stomach like a warm coal. He came across the room to them directly, which she found both presumptuous and somehow right. "Good evening," he said to her. To Caleb he said, "You look very serious and important." Caleb stood 2 inches taller. "Mama pressed my shirt," he said. "I can see that," Phineas said gravely. The social was the most pleasant evening Evelyn had spent in 14 months. There was fiddle music from the Garza brothers, who played fast and well, and dancing on the cleared floor, and food that everyone had brought, and the particular warmth of a community gathered in a closed space against the autumn cold. Mrs. Patterson came to discuss the dress alteration. Reverend Hollies made a toast that went on too long, and everyone was graciously patient about it. Caleb danced with 3 different little girls in a row, looking proud and mortified in equal measure. Phineas Sheridan asked her to dance. He did it quietly during a slower piece, standing beside her and saying simply, "Would you like to?" She said yes before she could talk herself out of it. He danced well, not showily but competently, leading with a steady hand and enough sureness that she did not have to think about it, could simply follow, which she had not done in years, and the feeling of it, of simply being held and led and not having to navigate everything herself, made her close her eyes for 2 bars of music before she caught herself. He did not say anything while they danced. He did not need to. The warmth of his hand at her back was enough conversation for the moment. Afterward they stood side by side and watched Caleb try to convince 2 other boys to look at something in the corner that he had found which appeared to be an interesting beetle. "He is going to be a remarkable person," Phineas said. "He already is," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "He is." She looked sideways at him. "Do you have family, somewhere you are going back to?" He considered this. "My parents died when I was 16. I have a cousin in St. Louis I correspond with occasionally." "That is it. That is it," he said. "That must be lonely," she said before she could moderate it. He was quiet for a moment. "It has been," he said, "more so lately than I accounted for." She did not ask what that meant. She thought she might know. The following week he helped her with the roof. She had not asked him to. She had noticed a section of shingles that had curled and mentioned it to Caleb, who of course mentioned it to Phineas, who of course appeared the next morning with tools she had not asked about and fixed it in 3 hours while she made him lunch. He was on the roof when Mrs. Clara Finch came by to visit, which was something Clara Finch did when she had information to spread, under the guise of community concern. Clara was perhaps 40, a small, quick-eyed woman who was the wife of the harness maker and who involved herself in the business of the entire town with an energy that would have been admirable if it were directed at anything more useful. Clara came into the kitchen and looked up at the ceiling at the sounds coming from above and said, "That man again." "He is fixing the shingles," Evelyn said. "So I see." Clara sat down uninvited, which was her habit. "You know, Evelyn, people are talking." "People always are," Evelyn said. "Coffee. He has been here for going on 2 weeks. He has been to your house every other day. He took you dancing at the social." Clara leaned forward. "Who is he?" "Nobody in town seems to know. He says his name, but he says nothing else." "He is someone passing through," Evelyn said. "He is not passing through," Clara said flatly. "He is sitting very still and watching things, which is different." Evelyn poured coffee and set a cup in front of Clara and did not say what she was thinking, which was that she agreed with Clara's observation and had been sitting with it herself for a week. "I am not foolish, Clara," she said instead. "I know you are not foolish," Clara said, with the particular sincerity that can only come from someone about to say something unkind. "I just want to be sure that you know it too. You are a widow with a young son, and this man has no visible means of support and no visible history, and is paying you a great deal of attention that would be flattering if it were not also rather inexplicable." Evelyn looked at her. "What is inexplicable about it?" Clara stopped. "I mean only that I am not unworthy of someone's attention, Clara." "Of course not," Clara said quickly. "I only meant his reasons. I think you should drink your coffee," Evelyn said pleasantly. Clara drank her coffee and left shortly after, and Evelyn sat alone in the kitchen and turned the conversation over in her mind with more honesty than she had allowed herself before. Clara was not wrong. She did not know who Phineas Sheridan was. He had given her his name and very little else. He was clearly educated, clearly not a rough man despite his worn clothes, clearly capable and careful. But she did not know where he came from or what he had, and she was, in fact, letting him into her house and her life and her son's affections on the basis of a biscuit he had given away, and a fence post he had repaired. She heard him coming down from the roof, and she went to the back door and held it open for him as he descended, and she said, "Come in and have some water. I want to ask you something." He came in and drank the water she gave him and looked at her with those eyes that were somehow both opaque and transparent, as though they let you see in but only so far. "Mr. Sheridan," she said, "who are you? Not your name, I know your name. Who are you really? Where do you come from and what do you do and why are you still in Caldwell?" He set down the water glass. He was quiet for what felt like a long time but was probably 15 seconds. Then he said, "I own things." She waited. "I own a great number of things," he said. "Property and land mainly, some businesses, a railroad interest in southern Kansas and northern Texas, cattle operations in 3 territories. I have been building it since I was 20 and I am now 35 and I have spent 15 years working, and I decided at the beginning of this autumn that I needed to stop and remember what things were like before I owned anything, because I had forgotten what I was without it. So I left everything in the hands of my business manager, and I took 1 horse and 1 saddlebag, and I have been riding since August." Evelyn stood completely still. "The worn clothes," he continued, looking at her steadily, "are actual. I did not dress down for effect. I have been traveling rough for 2 months, and I have not spent money on myself because I wanted to know what it felt like to have very little and to rely on my own 2 hands. I ate the last of my provisions the morning I gave your son that biscuit and I genuinely had nothing else. I was genuinely hungry." The kitchen was very quiet. "How wealthy are you?" Evelyn asked, because she was a practical woman and she thought the question was relevant. "I am the wealthiest man in this territory," he said, with no pride and no embarrassment, just the flatness of a man stating a fact he did not ask to be true. "Possibly in 3 territories. I have been somewhat uncertain about the precise accounting since I left because I did not bring any of my ledgers." Evelyn sat down at the kitchen table. She looked at the table surface for a moment and then back at him. He had not moved. He was standing with his hat in his hands again, in the way he stood whenever he was telling her something true. "And my homestead," she said slowly, "and my banknote, and my $60 in arrears." "I did not help you with your fence post because of your bank note," he said, and there was something sharp in his voice for the first time, not angry but earnest. "I helped you with your fence post because it was going to fail and you had done it yourself with the wrong method and I happened to know the right method. And I gave Caleb the biscuit because he was hungry and I had 1 biscuit to give. Nothing about either of those things had anything to do with what I own." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because when I told people in the past that I owned things, they stopped seeing me," he said simply. "They saw the things I owned instead. I wanted you to see me." The honesty of that landed in her chest and stayed there. "I have been seeing you," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "That is why I am still in Caldwell." She put her hands flat on the table. "I need to think," she said. "Of course," he said. "I mean I need to actually think, not just tonight, I need several days." "I will still be here," he said. "You keep saying that," she said. "It keeps being true," he said. He left and she sat at the table, and Caleb came home from school and ate his supper and went to bed. And she sat at the table for another 2 hours after that with the lamp burning down, and her thoughts moving in circles that slowly, over the course of those 2 hours, began to resolve into something straighter. She thought about Thomas, who had been a good man and a kind one and who she had loved, and whom she still missed, and who had kept things from her because he thought it was protection and had left her vulnerable instead. She thought about the past 14 months and how she had managed them and what she had learned about herself, which was that she was stronger than she had known and more capable than Thomas had given her credit for, and that she did not need saving. She thought about Phineas Sheridan giving away his last biscuit in an alley to a hungry child, and the quality of the silence he had held in the half a second between Caleb offering back half and him deciding to accept it, and she thought that was the truest thing she knew about him. She thought about the folded drying cloth. She thought about his hand at her back when they danced. She thought about the fact that he had been honest with her tonight when he could have kept the secret indefinitely, and used it however a man might want to use $60,000 of leverage over a woman in an impossible situation, and he had not. He had simply told her the truth when she asked for it because she had asked. She went to bed and slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The next morning she sent Caleb to school and walked into town and found Phineas Sheridan at the livery stable, brushing down his horse with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to everything. "I have thought," she said from the stable door. He turned around and waited. "I do not want your money," she said. "I want to say that first and clearly." "Understood," he said. "I am going to solve my own bank situation," she said. "I have a plan. It is not entirely comfortable and it involves asking Mrs. Calloway for a loan against the value of the quilts I have yet to finish, and then finishing them in time to pay it back, but it is my plan and I will execute it." "I have every confidence," he said. "But," she said, and she paused, and he waited with that extraordinary patience. "You are welcome to stay," she said, "in Caldwell, and you are welcome to come to supper and help Caleb with things and sit on my porch and look at the prairie. As a person. Not as someone with a railroad interest in cattle operations. As Phineas Sheridan who gave my son his last biscuit." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see something moving in his face that he was not trying to suppress, which was new. He usually suppressed everything. "I would like that very much," he said. She nodded once decisively in the way she had learned to nod when she made a decision and intended to stand by it, and walked home to write a letter to Mrs. Calloway about the loan. The weeks that followed were the happiest Evelyn had been since before Thomas died, and she allowed herself to know this without feeling disloyal, because she understood by now that happiness was not a betrayal of grief but a continuation of life. And Thomas, whatever his faults, had loved her and would not have wanted her to wither. Phineas was there every day, or nearly. He helped with the tasks that accumulated on a homestead the way snow accumulates, slowly and then all at once: the door hinge that needed replacing, the window that had swelled and would not close flush, the water pump that had developed an intermittent reluctance. He did not take over or manage or direct. He helped, and only where she wanted help, and he asked before he assumed, and she found that the asking was the thing she had not known she needed. He and Caleb developed a relationship that Evelyn watched with a kind of wonder. Phineas taught Caleb to whittle, starting him on something simple, and then moving him forward at exactly the right pace, not too fast and not too slow, with the patient attention of someone who understood how children learn. Caleb made a small horse that was recognizably a horse by the end of the second week, and he carried it everywhere, and told everyone at school he had made it himself, which was true, though he seemed to feel no need to mention the instruction, which Phineas found quietly hilarious. On a cold, late October evening, Phineas told her about his business. Not everything, but enough. He had started at 20 with nothing, the orphaned son of a failed farmer, working for a man who built small railroad supply depots along the developing lines in Kansas, and learning everything there was to know about how money moved and where it went. He had saved every penny for 3 years and used it to buy a partial stake in a depot himself, and then sold it at the right moment and bought land, and from land had grown everything else, slowly and with enormous patience and no small amount of luck, though he was careful to say that luck was mostly preparation meeting opportunity. He told her about the loneliness of it, which he did not glamorize. How the work had consumed everything until there was nothing outside it, and how one day he had looked at his life and found that he lived in a beautiful house in Wichita that he was never in, that he had more money than he could ever spend and no one to spend an evening with who wanted him specifically rather than what he represented. "Is that why you came here?" she asked. "To Caldwell, to find something." "I did not know I was looking for anything specific," he said. They were on the porch after supper, wrapped in coats, the stars very clear and cold above the Kansas plain. "I thought I was simply looking for quiet." "And instead you found a 7-year-old with questions and a widow with a failing fence post." "I found," he said carefully, "considerably more than I was expecting." She looked at the stars and did not answer, but she let his hand rest near hers on the porch rail and she did not move away, and after a moment his fingers closed gently over hers and she let them. They stayed like that for a long time, looking at the night sky over the Kansas plain, while inside the house Caleb slept with his whittled horse tucked against his cheek, and the wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like breathing. November came in hard and cold. Evelyn finished the 2 quilts in 3 weeks of working by lamplight until her eyes ached, and Mrs. Calloway, faced with the actual physical presence of the quilts, which were indeed beautiful, offered $12 for the pair. Evelyn said 15 and settled for 14, which was 67 cents more than what she needed to cover the loan repayment and the bank arrears, and she went to Mr. Greer's office and paid the full $60 in cash, and watched his tight little face struggle with the disappointment of not having a reason to pursue the foreclosure, and she felt something so close to triumph that she smiled at him broadly and thanked him for his patience. Phineas, when she told him that evening, laughed. A real laugh, not the contained trace of amusement she had been seeing for weeks. It was a good laugh, low and genuine, and it changed his face completely, made him younger and lighter, and Caleb looked delighted because he had not heard the man laugh like that before, and Evelyn thought, watching him, that she could very easily love this person if she was not careful, and then she thought that she probably was not going to be careful. On a Sunday in mid-November, Phineas asked her to walk with him along the ridge west of town. Just the 2 of them, with Caleb at the Gaines family's farm for the afternoon, where old Hector's grandson visited on Sundays, and the 2 boys had become fast friends. They walked out across the flat prairie land to the low ridge that lifted above the plain like a shallow wave, and the view from the top was the kind of view that made you understand why people had come to this place and fought for it and stayed. The vast golden-brown sweep of the Kansas plain under a November sky that was so blue it seemed almost aggressive, endless in every direction, and so full of space that you felt both small and freed by it. Phineas stood beside her at the top of the ridge and looked at it for a while without speaking. Then he said, "I need to tell you something." "All right," she said. "I received a letter from my business manager this week. There are matters in Wichita that need my attention. I have been away longer than I planned, and there are decisions that cannot be made without me." She felt the cold more sharply. "When do you need to go?" "Within the month," he said, "before the hard winter sets in." She looked at the plain. "I see." "Evelyn," he turned toward her, "I am not telling you I am leaving. I am telling you I have to go to Wichita. For a few weeks, perhaps a month. There is a difference." She looked at him. "Is there?" "Yes," he said firmly. "Because when I come back, I want to come back to something, to you, to Caleb. I want to come back and ask you something that I am not going to ask you today because it is too soon, and I know it is too soon, and I respect you and your judgment too much to ask it before you are ready." He paused, and his voice dropped to something more private. "But I need you to know that I am not going to disappear. I am not going to go to Wichita and become the man with the railroad interests and the ledgers, and forget that I stood on a porch in October and held your hand under the stars." She felt her throat tighten. "And I want you," he continued, steadier now, "to think, while I am gone, about whether a man like me, who has been very good at business and very poor at everything else, and who came to this territory wearing borrowed humility and borrowed poverty and gave a boy a biscuit that I genuinely had to give, could be what you and Caleb need. Because if you decide he cannot, I will accept that. But if you think he might be able to try, then I would like to come back and try." The wind moved across the ridge and pressed her skirt against her legs and lifted a strand of her hair across her face, and she pushed it back and looked at Phineas Sheridan, at this tall, quiet, complicated man with his dark blue eyes and his patient hands and his foolish, beautiful habit of giving away what he had to those who needed it more, and she said, "I think you had better come back." Something happened in his face that she thought might be the most vulnerable thing she had ever seen on a grown man, a flare of pure unguarded relief that he could not quite hide in time. "Good," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Good." He left for Wichita on the 1st of December, with the winter sky low and gray and the smell of coming snow in the air. Caleb cried, briefly, and with the dignity of a boy who was embarrassed to cry, and Phineas crouched down in the road and held the boy by the shoulders and said something quiet into his ear that Evelyn could not hear, and Caleb nodded with enormous seriousness and wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Then Phineas stood and looked at Evelyn and took her hand and held it for a moment, and she squeezed his fingers once, and he put on his hat and rode north toward Wichita, and she stood in the road with Caleb's hand in hers and watched him until the gray distance took him. "He said he would be back before Christmas," Caleb reported. "I know," she said. "He promised," Caleb said, in the particular tone of a child who is reassuring himself. She squeezed her son's hand. "He strikes me as a man who keeps his promises," she said. The weeks Phineas was gone were quieter than the weeks before he came and noisier than the weeks before she had met him, which was a strange thing to live inside. She was aware of his absence in the way that you become aware of a sound that has stopped, noticing the silence more than you notice the sound. She made her quilts and mended her fences and walked Caleb to school and cooked her simple suppers and wrote a letter to Phineas' care of his Wichita address. A short, careful letter that said very little and somehow said everything, and received back a letter that was longer than she expected and warmer than she had prepared herself for. He wrote about the business matters he was attending to, the property negotiations and the railroad discussions, but he wrote about them in a way that was self-aware and sometimes even gently mocking, as though he could now see the whole enterprise from a slight remove, and found parts of it absurd. He wrote about Wichita, which was a larger and louder place than Caldwell, and which he found he was tired of in a way he had not noticed before the autumn. He wrote about a bookshop he had passed and gone into on impulse and bought 3 books, and then wondered what he was going to do with them since he had nowhere to put them, and then said he supposed he would bring them to Caldwell since there seemed to be a small household there where they might be of use. Evelyn read that part of the letter 3 times and smiled at the page with an abandon she was glad no one was present to observe. She wrote back about the first hard freeze, which had arrived in the 2nd week of December and had tested the fence post, which had held. She wrote about Caleb's progress in school and the wooden horse he was now attempting, more ambitious than the first one. She wrote about the way the prairie looked in the first light snowfall, which had come on a Monday, just enough to silver the grass, and how Caleb had stood at the window in the early morning and said, with absolute conviction, that it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She almost wrote, "I think you should not have come back before Christmas. I think you should have come back sooner." But she did not, because it was true, and she was not quite ready to say things that true in a letter. He came back on the 19th of December. She heard the horse before she saw him, coming along the road from the north in the late afternoon, and something in the particular quality of the hoofbeats made her step out onto the porch before she had consciously decided to. And there he was, riding down out of the gray winter sky with a coat she had not seen before, a proper heavy coat for the cold, and a saddlebag that looked somewhat fuller than the one he had left with. He came through the gate and dismounted, and she was down the porch steps before she had made any deliberate decision to be, and when she reached him he looked at her with those eyes, those dark blue eyes that were somehow the same as they had always been but also somehow different, as though the weeks had clarified something behind them. He did not say anything, neither did she. She stood in front of him in the thin winter light, and he took a step forward and put one hand against the side of her face, carefully, as though she were something he had been afraid of losing and had not, and she turned her face very slightly into his palm, and that was enough. That was the whole conversation in a gesture, and he leaned down and kissed her. It was the gentlest kiss she had ever received, and also in some way the most certain, as though it had been decided long before this moment and was simply now being enacted, and she put her hand flat against his chest and felt his heartbeat, which was not entirely steady, and thought, with a clarity she had not known she was waiting for, yes. He pulled back after a moment and looked at her and said quietly, "I brought books." She laughed, a sound that surprised her, real and warm and slightly undignified, and he smiled, the full smile she had only seen a handful of times, and she thought that she would spend a good deal of the rest of her life looking for reasons to put that smile on his face. "Phineas," Caleb said from the porch at maximum volume, "you are back." "I am," Phineas said, not taking his eyes off Evelyn. "I made a horse," Caleb announced. "It has a saddle. Come and see it." Phineas squeezed Evelyn's hand once briefly, and then went up the porch steps and sat on the railing and held out his hand for the horse, and Caleb put it in his palm with enormous pride, and Phineas turned it over and examined it with perfect gravity and said, "This is a very fine horse," and Caleb said, "I know." They had dinner that evening and the books came out, 3 of them, a natural history of the Kansas prairie and 2 novels that she had not read and now immediately wanted to. And Caleb insisted on sitting between them at the table while Phineas read aloud from the natural history, specifically the section about meadowlarks, while Caleb listened with the whittled bird in his hand. After Caleb was asleep, they sat together by the fire, her in the chair and him on the bench with his legs stretched toward the warmth, and she said, "You mentioned there was something you wanted to ask me when you came back." He looked at the fire for a moment, then he looked at her. "I did say that." "I have been thinking," she said, "as you asked," and she held his gaze. "I think that a man who spent 15 years building an empire and then put on a worn coat and rode out into the prairie to remember who he was, and who spent part of that journey in my alley giving away his last biscuit is probably worth knowing, and possibly worth marrying if he is asking." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "He is asking." "Then the answer is yes," she said simply. He crossed the space between them in a way that was not hurried but was also not slow, and he knelt down beside her chair and took both her hands in both of his, and she looked at him from the firelight, and she thought, with the full quiet certainty of a woman who has survived enough to know what is real and what is not, that this was real. "I will not keep things from you," he said, "about money or about anything else. What is mine is yours, not as a thing I give you but as a thing we share. And I want Caleb to have everything, schooling and books and whatever future he wants. And I want to learn to do more than keep the fence post standing." She smiled at him. "You are fairly good at fence posts." "I am trying to make a larger point," he said. "I know," she said. "I accept all of it." He brought her hands to his mouth and kissed them, and outside the December wind moved across the Kansas plain, and the fire was warm and steady, and it was enough. They were married in February of 1879 at the Caldwell church on a cold, bright morning when the snow was on the ground but the sky was so clean and blue that it seemed to be celebrating. Reverend Hollis performed the ceremony with more warmth than usual, perhaps because even he could see that this particular joining was the kind that happened for the right reasons. Caleb stood at the front with them, at his own insistence, in his best shirt, with his wooden horse in his pocket for luck. He had decided that Phineas was going to be his father with the same immediate clarity with which he had decided, on the morning in the alley, that the man was hungry and needed to share the biscuit, and there was nothing provisional or uncertain about it. Evelyn wore the dark blue dress she had made 2 years ago, but she had added a collar of white lawn that she had found at the bottom of her fabric box and sewed on by lamplight the night before, and she had her hair pinned up but with a few curls at the sides the way she used to do it on Saturday evenings in Ohio when Thomas was alive, and there was something to dress for. And there was something to dress for again, something to dress for in a different way now. In a way that was entirely her own choosing and no one else's. Phineas stood at the altar and watched her come down the short aisle between the church pews with Caleb beside her, and the look on his face was one she would remember for the rest of her life. Not the raw vulnerability of the porch in December, but something older and quieter than that, the look of a man who has come home. They said their vows, each of them steady and clear, and when Reverend Hollis pronounced them, married Caleb said, in a carrying whisper to the small assembled company, "I knew it," which produced a laugh that echoed pleasantly off the church's plain wooden walls. Clara Finch was there, looking approximately 20% genuinely happy and 80% extremely intrigued, which was probably the most honest expression she was capable of making. Old Hector Gaines was there, and Mrs. Harmon, the schoolteacher, and the Garza brothers who had provided the music at the Harvest Social, and who had apparently made friends with Phineas over some guitar-playing evening at the saloon that Evelyn had not known about. The reception was held at the homestead, which was already beginning to feel different than it had, not because anything structural had changed, but because Phineas's presence had been so thorough and unself-conscious that it had seeped into the walls somehow, his coat on the peg by the door and his books on the shelf and his tools in the barn and his quiet voice in the morning. It was, everyone agreed, a fine wedding. By spring, the homestead had been genuinely transformed. Phineas had been careful about this, careful not to impose or overwhelm, and he had asked her about every significant change before making it. But he was also a man of enormous practical capability, and now that he was no longer pretending not to have resources, he applied them with the same measured intelligence he apparently applied to everything. The house gained 2 rooms. A real bedroom, larger than the original one, which had been barely big enough for a bed and a washstand, and a proper study that Evelyn claimed immediately for her sewing, and which Phineas said he had built for her sewing and not for his papers, though he would need a corner of it for papers if she was agreeable. She was agreeable. The corner of the study had a small desk that he built himself, because he seemed to genuinely enjoy building things, and she caught him at it sometimes in the evenings, methodical and quiet, fitting joints with a precision that was almost meditative. He had a letter delivered to Mr. Greer at the bank in late February that resulted in the note on the property being paid in full, and the deed being transferred into both their names, and she had watched Mr. Greer's face during the brief meeting at the bank, and felt a satisfaction that she was probably too Christian to be entirely proud of. Caleb started calling Phineas Pa sometime in March, without ceremony or announcement. He simply began doing it, the way children do things, as though the word had always been there, and he had just now remembered it. Phineas had gone very still the first time he heard it, just for a moment, and then had answered as naturally as though it had been his title all along. Evelyn watched this from the kitchen doorway and went to the basin and washed a cup that was already clean, because she needed something to do with her hands while her throat was doing things she did not want to manage in front of either of them. In the summer of 1879, Evelyn discovered she was expecting. She told Phineas on an evening in June on the porch, where they had taken to sitting together at the end of the day. The air was warm and the fireflies were out, which was the beginning of firefly season, and Caleb was chasing them in the yard with a glass jar that he had decided was a humane containment device, and she had decided not to argue about. She said it simply, the way she said most things now, and waited. Phineas looked at her for a long moment, and then he turned toward the yard where Caleb was running through the grass with his jar held up, and then back at her, and the expression on his face was so private and complete that she felt she should look away, except that she wanted to see it very much. "Are you all right?" he asked first. "I am more than all right," she said. He took her hand. "Good," he said. "That is very good." Caleb, intercepted on one of his passes across the yard, was told the news and received it with the grave consideration of a boy thinking it through. Then he said, "Will it be a boy or a girl?" "We do not know yet," Evelyn said. "I hope it is a boy," Caleb said. "But I will be fine with a girl. I will teach her to whittle." "That is very magnanimous," Phineas said. "What does that mean?" Caleb asked. "Generous," Phineas said. Oh, Caleb seemed pleased. "Yes, it is." The boy, whose name was Henry Thomas Sheridan, was born in late February of 1880, in the bedroom of the extended homestead, in a proper bed, with the doctor from Wichita present because Phineas had arranged it well in advance, and had been, if she was being honest, somewhat excessively thorough about all of it, double-checking everything 3 times and riding to Wichita himself in December to speak with the doctor in person about the arrangements. She had found this endearing in a way she could not entirely explain, given that she had produced Caleb with far fewer preparations and in considerably less comfortable circumstances. There was something in being the object of that thoroughness, in having someone who cared about the outcome enough to ride to Wichita in December, that settled in her chest and stayed there. Henry was a loud, red-faced, thoroughly healthy baby with a great deal of dark hair and his father's wide, measuring eyes. Caleb looked at him with the expression of someone confronted with an interesting scientific specimen and said, "He is very small." "You were also very small," Evelyn said. "I do not remember that," Caleb said. Phineas was holding Henry with the careful deliberateness of a man who is afraid of dropping something irreplaceable, which she found so unlike his usual ease that it was almost funny, except that it was also the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Hello, Henry," Phineas said, very quietly to the baby. "I am your father. I will try to be worthy of it." Evelyn pressed her face into the pillow so that nobody would see her cry, and then decided she was allowed to cry, and cried anyway. Over the next several years, Caldwell grew and changed around them, as the cattle drives moved north and the railroad extended, and the territory filled with more homesteaders and more commerce, and more of the noise and complication of a country making itself. There were injustices in all of it, injustices Evelyn and Phineas spoke about in the evenings by the fire, the dispossession of the Wichita people from the land that bore their name, the unequal treatment of the Mexican vaqueros who worked the cattle operations in the southern territories, the grinding poverty that the homesteading system created and could not always resolve. Phineas, with his considerable resources, was in a position to do something about some of it, and he did, quietly and without fanfare, paying fair wages at his operations when the industry standard was not fair, supporting the small school for Mexican children that a priest had established outside Wichita, writing letters to the territorial government about the treatment of the Osage. He did not make speeches about it. He simply did what he could and acknowledged when they talked about it that what he could do was not enough, and that some of what he had was built on a system that had taken from others. She loved him for this, among many other things. Caleb grew into a young man who was curious and capable, and who had his biological father's eyes and something of his quiet patience, but also something of Phineas's particular way of watching the world, that careful measuring attention, and she thought sometimes that you did not have to be born of someone to carry something of them. By the summer of 1882, Henry was 2.5 and had an opinion about everything and no reservations about expressing it at volume, and was entirely beloved by the whole family for this. And Caleb was 11, and in serious conversation with Phineas about what kind of schooling he wanted eventually, whether he wanted the school in Wichita or whether he had ambitions for something further, perhaps one of the colleges in the East. "I want to be an engineer," Caleb said at the supper table with the firmness of someone who has thought about this carefully. Evelyn and Phineas looked at each other across the table. "What kind?" Phineas asked. "I want to build bridges," Caleb said. "And railroads, and things that make the territory work better." "We can arrange that," Phineas said. Caleb nodded seriously, as though this had been a business negotiation, and he was satisfied with the terms. Henry, at this moment, dumped his cup of milk over the edge of the table and onto the floor, which he observed with scientific interest and then said, "Oh," which was his standard response to catastrophes he had personally caused. Evelyn was laughing by the time she reached for the cloth, and Phineas was watching her laugh with that particular look he had been wearing for 3 years now, the quiet certain one, and the afternoon light came through the kitchen window and fell across the table where her family sat, and the Kansas plain stretched golden and endless beyond the glass, and she thought that she had not known, in the dark autumn months after Thomas died, that this was waiting. She had not known. But it had been, and she had walked toward it one careful step at a time, through grief and poverty and fear and practical stubbornness, through $9 quilts and leaning fence posts, and the very specific kind of courage it takes to let a stranger in. And she had arrived here, at this kitchen, at this table, at this man who had given away his last biscuit and then stayed. That evening, after the children were asleep, she and Phineas sat on the extended porch that had been built the previous spring, facing west, watching the last of the light die over the Kansas plain. The prairie grass moved in the evening wind, and the first stars were beginning to show at the edges of the sky, pale and uncertain, and then clearer as the dark deepened. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she had been doing for 3 years now and which still felt, each time, like a small, deliberate choice. "I am thinking about the morning I found you in the alley," she said. He made a sound that was warm and slightly self-deprecating. "That was not my finest hour presentation-wise." "It was exactly your finest hour," she said. "That was who you are without any of the other things. Just a man with a biscuit who looked at a hungry child and gave it away." He was quiet for a moment. His arm was around her and she could feel him breathe. "I was also genuinely hungry," he said. "I know," she said. "That is what made it remarkable." He turned his head and pressed his mouth against her hair, and she closed her eyes and felt the weight of his arm around her and the warmth of the house at her back and heard, faint and distant, the sound of Henry making some small noise in his sleep. "Phineas," she said, "yes, I am glad you were passing through." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke his voice was low and sure. "So am I," he said. "Although I should say that this is not what passing through looks like as a rule." "What does this look like then?" He considered the question with the same thoughtful patience he brought to everything, and the stars came out above the Kansas plain and the grass moved and the night settled in around them. "This," he said, "looks like staying." She smiled into the dark. It was the truest thing. All the months and years that came after were built on the foundation of that October morning in Caldwell, Kansas, when a dusty drifter sat in an alley, and a small boy watched him with hungry eyes, and the man reached into his coat and produced the last thing he had, and held it out without a moment's calculation. It was not a grand gesture. It was just a biscuit. But the largest things in a human life are almost never grand gestures. They are small, truthful ones, repeated over time, accumulated like interest, becoming in the end something so solid and real that no bank can call it in, and no hard freeze can topple it. Evelyn Wainwright had learned in the hard years to read the quality of a person's character from the small, unguarded things they did, the reflexive kindnesses and the thoughtless generosities, the way someone folded a cloth or held a door or crouched down to look a child in the eye. She had read Phineas Sheridan from those small things before she knew anything else about him, and every large thing she had learned since had only confirmed what the small things had already told her. She had not needed saving. She had said this to him once in their 2nd year of marriage, and he had looked at her steadily and said he had never come to Caldwell to save anyone. He had come, as he had told her at the start, for quiet, and she had given him something better than quiet. She had given him noise of the particular kind that belongs to a family, to a kitchen with children in it, and laughter that runs faster than you can catch it, and arguments that resolve themselves, and evenings that go on longer than they should because no one wants to be the first to say good night. He had given her, in return, not rescue but partnership. The particular partnership of a man who has learned that what he values most cannot be bought or built or leveraged, only lived, one honest day at a time. In the spring of 1884, Evelyn learned she was expecting again. Their daughter, Josephine Ruth Sheridan, named for Evelyn's mother who had died in Ohio the previous winter, arrived in November, small and fierce and absolutely clear from the first hour that she had opinions. Caleb, now 13, observed his sister with the same scientific gravity he brought to all new phenomena, and said she reminded him of their mother. Phineas laughed and agreed. Evelyn pretended to find this observation insulting, and then admitted that it was probably accurate. Henry, at 4, was not especially interested in the baby yet, but was very interested in the story of how babies came to be. A conversation that occupied Phineas and Evelyn in a tag-team effort for approximately 3 weeks, and that Phineas, to his credit, handled with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to everything. And so the homestead at the edge of Caldwell became a house full of years and children and books and hand-carved horses, and the smell of baking, and the sound of fiddle music on the evenings when the Garza brothers came by. The fence post that Phineas had reset in October of 1878 stood through every freeze for 12 years before it finally needed replacing, and when it did, he and Caleb replaced it together, working side by side in the early morning cold, packing it exactly right, while Evelyn stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched them and thought that some things, fixed properly and with care, stand longer than you expect. All of it had started with a biscuit. All of it, the whole of this life she had built and rebuilt and built again, in its grief and its joy and its practical dailiness, and its particular western light, and its wide sky, and its winter cold, and its spring thaw, and its 2 children who carried her eyes and his hands, and a third who carried something all her own. All of it had started with a moment of simple, uncalculated generosity in an alley on an October morning, when a hungry man looked at a hungrier child and did the only thing that seemed right to do. She thought about this sometimes in the quiet hours and felt something she did not always have a word for, something that was gratitude and wonder and a particular solemnity about the strangeness of how lives turn, how the whole direction of a thing can hinge on something as small and real as a biscuit offered freely from the last of what you have. She was glad she had been at the alley entrance that morning. She was glad she had stopped. She was glad that she had seen it and carried the seeing of it into every subsequent thing and let it be the measure of the man. She was glad, above all, that she had opened the door,